What's going on, ladies, gents, and kids of all ages? It is Eric coming back at you once again from the Nerd Cave, and today we're going to be talking about a variety of decks, actually. I'm going to be talking about your best potential options to play set championships and what is going to be the most likely to send you home with a Mirabelle or even a playmat as well. Before we jump into our list of the top 7 decks, I just want to give a big shout out to the Patreons for supporting the channel. Couldn't do it without you. We got that giveaway coming up in about 100 subscribers, so if you aren't subscribed to the channel, now's a great time to do so. Once we hit 2,000 subscribers, we're going to be doing another giveaway, and please give a shout out to the Patreons in the comments below if you like the giveaways, because they are the ones that make it possible. If you want to check out that Patreon and some of the perks that you do get with joining, definitely check it out at the link in the description below if you want to support the channel other ways. We do also have a website, also linked in the description below, where you can buy things including apparel related to Lorcana. So if you like a good Lorcana t-shirt and want to rep your favorite game, go pop over there under the apparel tab on NerdCave.shop. We will be talking about the top 7 decks in no particular order. We have 4 meta decks and 3 off-meta decks. I'm not going to be including some decks that I think are meta but are not the most meta relevant, so they're not the most likely to be played, but aren't meta decks that have been talked about time and time again before. If you want to see some videos on some of those potential options, I do have some on the channel. There are also definitely some on other channels, like decks featuring Mufasa or Green Purple. I would consider those meta decks, even though they're on the low end of the meta. I think it's stuff people have heard about before, so we're not going to be talking about those. We're going to be talking about the 4 top decks as well as 3 off meta decks. We're going to be kind of doing a meta deck, non-meta deck, so on like that throughout the video. So like I mentioned, in no particular order. Without any further ado, let's jump into it with the first deck we're going to talk about today, which is going to be Ruby Amethyst Control. I think Ruby Amethyst Control is in a really interesting spot in the meta right now. It's definitely not something I expect to see as much of as we have in past set championships. We're in a steel heavy meta, and Ruby Amethyst is going to have a tough time into some of those steel decks. It's going to have a tough time potentially with the card draw advantage and discards that they can cause with the Emerald Steel deck that's running rampant right now. And honestly, Steel Song has always kind of been a mixed bag matchup for Ruby Amethyst. I think that's why those 2 decks were the top for so long. To help combat that meta, we're doing a couple things. So I found that I was able to beat Bucky in set championships when he was still legal by just focusing a lot on draw, and that is something that I think is still going to hold true into the Emerald Steel meta now. I think having Magic Broom and Chernobog's followers is important, but I have reduced the amount a little bit to be able to put in a few Olafs, because in that steel matchup, Olaf can be a really good opener as well, and particularly into Steel Song, Olaf is going to be a lot better to have than a Chernobog or a Broom, because generally they're going to be trying to go turn 1 Cinderella. Then we do also play Kuzco in the 2-drop slot. Kuzco is another great way to kind of take their foot off the gas. They aren't necessarily going to want to use removal on Kuzco like they would with most characters, because you are going to be netting some card draw from it. They may if they're smart, because one thing it is going to deny by removing your Kuzco is your ability to get your Mim Fox down on 3, but a lot of times they may leave that Kuzco out, which is going to leave you an opportunity to quest and then get that Mim Fox down, which is fantastic into most any deck. Great way to deal with those daisies if they're on a daisy list. Jumping over to those 3-drop characters, of course we do have those foxes and those crabs. We're not going to talk about every card in the deck. Crab is a great way to get additional value out of something like Elsa, or with a fox bounce, you can play fox, bounce the crab, trigger its ability onto the fox, and deal 7 damage to something, which is always fantastic. We're on 4 Merlin Goats, which are great to just close out games, 4 Merlin Rabbits to keep that card draw going with the Mim Bounce package. It's pretty traditional Ruby Amethyst. Biggest thing I'm doing differently here is I am on 3 of those Rush Elsas that are letting you tap things down, because I think she's really good. She does also give you access to the Shift Elsa on 6. She does stay on the board a lot of times because she does have 5 defense, so it's going to be hard for your opponent to take out, and she is evasive, so they can't attack into it unless they have an evasive character. She does die to things like Brawl with only 2 attacks, so perhaps in the mirror match it is less good, but if you can get that Elsa Shift down on it, start locking things down, that can be really good, and then obviously taking advantage of that with the bounce package can be good. Maui's always been a staple, still great. Meta Medusa's here. I feel like Robin Hood's going to be really relevant in the meta, so getting that Medusa down is going to be a good way to deal with Robin Hood. You could make the argument for going to 3 Medusas, maybe reducing the count of Bee King Undisputed, but I've always had a good experience with Bee King, particularly singing it with the goat and the rabbit, so I think Bee King is still really good. Brawl is fantastic in the meta, great way to deal with those aerials before they can get value out of singing. 4 Be Prepareds I think is the good place to be if you're not playing a Sisu. If you're playing a Sisu, perhaps you reduce the count of Be Prepared. 4 Libraries is definitely the spot now. Library I think has kind of taken over the meta compared to even Queen's Castle. Queen's Castle is netting you that 2 lore and potential card draw, but sometimes the library is netting you that card draw more in real time, and it does have an additional point of defense, which is definitely not irrelevant into those steel matchups. So I think with a steel dominant meta, 4 libraries where you want to be, and card draw you really want to be focused on. So I think this deck is the optimal build for Ruby Amethyst into a fairly standard meta. If you're playing into a lot of aggro decks, perhaps you remove the Elsas, you move away from the library a little bit, focus more on characters that are going to deal with the early game. I think this is kind of balanced to go up into every deck, but if you are in a highly hyper aggro meta, which I think is not going to be the case for most people, perhaps you make some tweaks to this list. But that is Ruby Amethyst for our top 7. We'll go ahead and jump over to another Ruby deck. Now we are talking off meta. We do have Ruby Steel, a color combination I don't think was really on anybody's radar, and then all of a sudden we had a deck take top 64 in DLC Vegas with it. It's a really interesting deck if you can get it moving correctly. Piloting it can be pretty tough, but if you can get the deck moving correctly, you can definitely do some shenanigans things with the Dwarves in the mine. I think it's really kind of interesting. But we are on 4 Happy and 4 Robin Hood as our 1 drops. Happy is going to be great to take advantage of those 7 Dwarves mines. He is also going to be fantastic as a way to answer Diablo if they don't kill him with direct damage, because he is going to have evasive during your turn. Obviously Robin Hood is here as a shift target. Moving over to those 2-drop characters, we do have Flynn Rider, great way to take advantage of cards like Gustav the Giant. He does also pair very nicely with the 3-drop Sisu, which is going to get plus attack for the amount of cards in their hand, something that we've been seeing in Ruby Amethyst for a while. And then even cards like Jim Hawkins can be decent to activate his ability with 4 attacks. Sometimes that can put you outside of stuff, especially if you're controlling the board decently. Then we do have Doc. Doc is a card I've been hot on since the set came out. He is uninkable, which is rough, but if you're playing a deck like this with very limited draw, Doc can be super good. He's a 2-cost uninkable 1/3 character. When he comes into play, you're going to go ahead and discard your hand and draw 2 cards, but if you have no cards in your hand, there's nothing to discard, so you're just getting 2 cards for 2 ink and developing a 1/3 character questing for 1. Last up in the 2-drop slot, one of the top 17 cards in Disney Lorcana right now, in my opinion. If you haven't seen that video, definitely go check it out. I'll link it on screen. Is Mr. Smee, a 2-cost inkable character, 3/3 questing for 2, which is absolutely nutty. Deals with those foxes, deals with those snakes. He is fantastic in that regard. You don't have any way to heal him in this deck, but you do have stuff like John Silver that's a captain that could potentially keep him from taking that ping damage. Not an irrelevant point to John Silver. I think it's something people often overlook with playing John Silver in combination with Smee, but I think those cards together, especially when you have a couple locations, could potentially be really good. Obviously this deck isn't as location heavy, which is why we are on 3 John Silver. Then we do have the Big Sisu, another card that I talked about as one of the top 17 cards in Lorcana right now. Fantastic 1/4 stat line for 3, questing for 2, so it stays away from a lot of that steel damage that's really relevant to the meta right now, and it's getting stronger for the cards in your opponent's hand, so it's a great way to deal with some of those bigger threats potentially. Tuk Tuk is a card not everybody's been hot on, but I think he is fantastic. A 3-cost inkable character, 2/3 stat line evasive, so he is going to be able to deal with those Diablos. When he comes down, you're going to be able to move him and another character into a location for free, and that other character is going to get +2 attack, so you could potentially do something into like a Daisy board or into an aggro board, even into something like Steel Song where they have maybe Cinderella and Daisy on the board, where you play Happy, you do go ahead and turn to develop the 7 Dwarves Mine, which is a 2-cost inkable location that when characters move into it, you're going to be able to deal 1 to an opposing character. If it is a dwarf character, you're going to be able to deal 2, and it is just the first time that happens each turn, but you can go ahead and move Tuk Tuk and Happy into it on 3. When you play Tuk Tuk, you're going to be able to boost Happy up to a 4/1, ping something for 2 damage, potentially taking out that Cinderella, and then get a straight up trade into Daisy Duck, which is great. And unless you're on 2/7 Dwarves Mine, you really don't need the Happy because you can't move him into the location again, so letting him go at that point isn't a big deal. We're on 3 Benja to deal with those item decks, less relevant to Steel Song currently. I'm seeing a lot less people playing Lantern or Sleepy Flute, but if they are, Benja can be great in that matchup, and obviously he's fantastic into pretty much anything playing Sapphire. Next up, we do have Gustav the Giant, something that I really wanted to make a deck function around for a while, and I really feel like they did it with this one. 6/6 character, 3 cost, inkable. He does come into play tapped, and he stays tapped unless you banish a character. He doesn't untap at the beginning of your turn, so he's a little cumbersome to get untapped. However, with something like Flynn, you go turn 1 Flynn, turn 2 Gustav. Super hard for them to deal with. They're looking at dealing with the Flynn at that point. They're not going to have access to Maui yet at that point in the game, and even if they do, it's going to be a straight up trade with Gustav. If they really want to trade a 5 cost character for a 3 cost character, probably not. Then we do have John Silver, that 3 cost inkable, 3/3 stat line, and he is getting +1 lore and +1 resist for every single location you have in play, which is absolutely crazy. Generally, it's only going to be 1 or 2 locations, but when something's questing for 3 and has resist 2, that's still pretty good. And we are on 4 Pete Games Warden. You know him, you love him. One of the super staple cards in Steel in the meta right now. Most decks running Steel are running 4 Pete's. He is going to completely prevent your opponent from playing actions during their next turn. So if you're going into that be prepared turn, you're going into a turn where you think your opponent's going to need to play something like Whole New World, you can say, nope, not this turn, you do that next turn, and it just really can disrupt their play lines. And then we have 4 Goofy. Super Goof. He is a 2/4 weird stat line. He does have rush, but when he rushes into a character and challenges them, doesn't have to banish them, he is going to go ahead and net you 2 lore, so he's a great way to close out games. He's jumping you by 2. Everybody's on Goat, who's only jumping you by 1, although he jumps you by another one when he leaves. The bounce is really good. Goof is generally only getting you that 2 lore 1 time. You're probably not going to get to take advantage of this a second time because of its kind of low defense. They'll probably attack into it and kill it, or go ahead and banish it with some kind of direct damage spell, but he is going to get that 2 lore value and just push you ever closer to victory. Then we are on 2 Prince Eric, a 4 cost uninkable character. When he's banished, you can banish target characters, so great way to deal with some of those bigger threats like Tamatoa. 3 Jim Hawkins, a 5 cost inkable 4/4, questing for 2. When he comes into play, you get to play a location for free and then move him there for free. Great way to get those RLS legacies down and reduce the cost to move additional characters in there. RLS legacy is definitely worth mentioning while we're here. It is going to give all of your characters evasive while they're in there, so it's a great way to prevent your opponent from attacking in favorably. If you can get a Super Goof, for instance, into RLS legacy, can potentially keep him alive for multiple turns to net you 4 lore instead of 2. Last 5 cost card we're going to be playing is Robin Hood, a 3/6 stat line. Inkable character, shifting for 3, which is fantastic. Come down really early in the game. Every time he banishes a character, you're going to go ahead and net 2 lore, so he can potentially gain you lore without questing. And when he is banished in a challenge, you're going to go ahead and draw a card. So unless your opponent is using direct removal to do that last little bit of damage to him and get rid of him, you are potentially going to get to draw a card and he is going to replace himself. I think this deck is really super interesting. I think it plays well into the current meta. I think mulligans are super important, and being able to pilot it effectively is also really important. So it's not a deck, if you've never played it, that I would take directly into set championships. It's the type of deck that I would try to go ahead and get a lot of practice in, get some reps in with before you hit those set championships with it. But if you pilot it well, you could definitely do quite well. Speaking of Steel Song, we'll go ahead and talk about what I think is probably the most popular build for Steel Song right now. You could definitely make some tweaks to the quantities of cards as you see fit. I do think there is definitely an argument for Alphinum Malflatinum in the current meta, so we are on one of those. You'll see that at the bottom, banish all items. It is inkable, so it's potentially ink in those matchups where it is not as useful, but I think having one in the deck is useful, especially with as much card draw as you're doing with a Whole New World. But in the 1-drop slots, we are on Cinderella and Robin Hood, super typical 1-drop openers. Singer 3 on Cinderella and Robin Hood to create that shift line. Turn 2, we are moving into Piglet, Pooh Pirate Captain, where we are potentially going to be able to get that quest for 3 on 3. In the Steel Song Mirror match or in the Green Steel match, he is less good because he is potentially going to get banished before he gets any value, so you may be inking him in favor of playing something like Ursula, a 2-cost inkable 1/4 stat line, which is going to stay outside of the steel damage, and has Singer 4, so she is going to be able to sing those Along Came Zeus, as well as those cheaper songs, while potentially staying alive a little bit better than something like Cinderella. The last 2-cost character we are on, 3 of those Mr. Smees. Already talked about him, so we're not going to reiterate what he does, but still fantastic. He is also very good in this deck with Rapunzel, who is going to be able to heal something and net you some card draw. Then we do have our standard Ariel, Spectacular Singer, 2/3 character, coming down for 3 and having Singer 5 while also letting you dig for a song. Great way to sing those Whole New Worlds. That one, Grab Your Swords, she can also sing Zeus and any of the cheaper songs. She sings every song in the deck, so Ariel's great. I am on 2 Lawrence still. Some people have moved away from Lawrence, but he is a 3-cost inkable 0/4 character. When he has no damage on him though, he is a 4/4, so he's a great way to take out some of those bigger threats, while also questing for 2. So you may potentially be able to just quest in their face with him while they have to attack into him and take that damage. However, if you take that risk, they could potentially deal direct damage to him, particularly if they're playing steel, shut off his ability to have attack damage, and then just kill him with really any character. Pete, we already talked about. Shutting off your opponent's actions is fantastic. Prince Naveen is a great new card in the meta. I've seen people with this deck list on 4 Prince Naveens. I think 3 is kind of the sweet spot. When you have him in your hand and you don't have a song to play with him, he is not great because he is a 4-cost uninkable character with a 3/3 stat line, which isn't the most exciting, but he does have Singer 6. And when you play him, you may play a 6-cost or less song from your hand for free. So when he's coming down, he can sing any potential song in the deck. A great way to get out those whole new worlds, very much on curve with when you're running out of cards in your hand. So Naveen is great. I'm not saying he's not great, but I don't know that he's a 4 of in my opinion. Rapunzel has several heal targets in this deck to go ahead and net you some card draw, drawing you 1 card for each point of damage. She heals up to 3. Then we do have our Robin Hood shift line. Already talked about him, so we won't reiterate on this deck list. But fantastic to get down on 3, and he can sing a whole new world with your list, which is really the main thing he's doing different here. We have a Cinderella shift. Normally she comes down for 7, but she's shifting for 5. 2 of those in the deck, and she is a 7-cost inkable. She has a pretty neat ability in that she has resist 2, so she's going to be hard to deal with. Maui doesn't necessarily take her out. He's going to leave her 1 point shy of being banished. And whenever you play a song, she may challenge ready characters. So particularly if you are able to get that shift, which is a little tough because Cinderella, the smaller Cinderella, is generally coming down pretty early in the game unless you draw into another one. Being able to shift into this big Cinderella and then sing a song is absolutely crazy because you're going to be able to go ahead and banish most things on the board in that situation, other than maybe something like Tamatoa. Then moving over to our song package, we do have 2 Bare Necessities, which is a great way to get out any non-character card from your opponent's hand. Great way to deal with locations, lucky dimes, fishbone quills, other songs. Really, really versatile card. Let the Storm Rage On, dealing 2 and drawing a card. Great way to knock out a character with Cinderella, especially in the early game, and get a little bit of card draw still going to keep your hand more versatile. Strength of a Raging Fire is a 3-cost inkable song, so being inkable is great. Is also going to work well with Cinderella, and it's going to deal 1 damage for each character you have in play. So in turn 3, 4, 5, it starts to get really, really good as long as you're keeping characters on the board. Along Came Zeus is going to deal 5 damage to a character or location, which is definitely relevant because it can help you deal with those locations, since a lot of your characters have fairly low strength other than the big Cinderella. And Lawrence, that's another reason Lawrence and like Smee and stuff are here. I already talked about I Find Him a Platinum. Whole New World is going to let both players discard their hand and draw 7 new cards, which is great and is singable with Prince Naveen, Ariel, all that stuff. So you're kind of gassing out your hand and then Whole New Worlding into a new hand. Grab Your Swords has fallen out of favor in some instances, but just in case of that low willpower matchup, particularly those characters with Ward and things like that, I think Grab Your Swords can be good to just kind of wipe out a field or do some damage onto a field and let you pick them off with your other characters. Can potentially shut off things like opposing Lawrence's if your opponents are playing those as well. That's kind of the breakdown on top 7 Steel Song. We'll jump into the next deck list. So the next off-meta list we're going to talk about is Blurple. This is my own version of Blurple. I may be doing things differently than you have seen before, but I feel really good about where this list is at. Jumping right into it, we are on 4 Cogsworth in the 1-drop slot. He is a 1/1 character questing for 1, but he is potentially going to be able to give those other characters rush. So you're not always going to be looking to play him on 1, but he can be played on 1. This deck is fairly greedy in that Cogsworth is your only 1-drop and your ink ramp doesn't happen right away, but after that turn 3, that's when you really start kind of taking control of the board. So Cogsworth can deal with those 1 defense characters in the early game, but is generally going to be coming down a little bit later. You're not doing a lot on 1 with this deck. And then we do have Madam Mim Snake, a 2-cost inkable character, 3/3, bouncing another character back to your hand. Again, probably not something you're going to be playing on curve. She's going to be coming down a little bit later. On 2, we're going to be looking to play something like 1 Jump Ahead to ramp an ink, or Tipo to ramp an ink. Particularly with Tipo, it's a great way to kind of curve into Madam Mim Fox on turn 3 a 4/3 character and get Tipo back in your hand, then play Tipo again to ink another card potentially. We do have Merlin Crab also in the 3-drop slot, giving those other characters a boost in their attack. So if you do have something like Cogsworth out, can potentially make Cogsworth attack for 4 in the early game, which can be surprising to your opponent, or make a snake attack for 6. Last up in the 3-drop slot, we have Mickey Mouse Detective, a 1/3 character, 3-cost, uninkable. When he comes down, he is also going to be ramping out the top card of your deck. He is also fantastic with Snake and Fox to bounce him back to your hand and continue to ramp from the top of your deck. Merlin Goat as a 2 of, and Merlin Rabbit as a 4 of. When they come into play, when they leave play, they have ability triggers. Goat is going to be getting you lore, and Merlin Rabbit is going to be drawing you cards. Then this is where the deck really kind of starts to get spicy. We do have 2 of those bells that are going to be questing for 5 if you have enough ink in your inkwell, which is entirely possible with this deck. In the 5-drop slot, we have for the Elsa with Russian Evasive, 2/5 character, 5-cost inkable, Russian Evasive, and she is going to be a great way to shift in that big Elsa on 6 and start just really locking the board down while bouncing her back and forth to your hand with things like Snake and Fox. We do also have in our 5-drop slot a Cogsworth potential shift. We have the small Cogsworth coming down for 1, and then we have this Cogsworth shifting for 3 and giving everything resist 1, which can be pretty crazy. He does also have wards, so as long as you're not questing with him, he's incredibly difficult for your opponent to deal with, and he does quest for 2 if you do want to quest with him. We have 4 Develop Your Brain, one of your only options on turn 1. Go ahead and draw some cards. 1 Jump Ahead, which is going to ink for you on turn 2. Friends, which will help you draw some cards on turn 3, on turn 5, or when we have a 5-cost Singer out, which is entirely possible on turn 4. We do have Let It Go. Let It Go is going to put one of your opposing characters into that player's inkwell, which can be good situationally to deal with like Tamatoa, Big Cinderella, stuff like that. 2 Lucky Dimes to gain lore without questing with those new characters that come into play. Obviously we have things that are questing for 3, 5, 2, so being able to take advantage of them with Lucky Dime is entirely possible. And then Queen's Castle just as another way to deal with perhaps the other Sapphire decks in the meta. It's pretty good into Steel Song. They're going to have a hard time killing it in some instances if you're keeping control of their board, locking down their board a little bit, and it's going to net you 2 lore and give you some additional card draw, which is definitely great for this deck. Blurple I think is a little bit interesting. I don't know that it's going to be the absolute best deck to play in the current meta. I do think it is a lot of fun to play. You can definitely make some tweaks to this particular list, but don't sleep on Rush Cogsworth. He's very good. Jumping over to our second to last meta deck, we are going to talk about Zan Syed's top 7 Emerald Steel discard deck. Did not make a full deck breakdown on this deck because so many people were doing it, but we're going to talk about it a little bit because I think it is entirely relevant to your experience at set championships, whether you choose to play it or you're just having to play into it. It's good to know what you have coming, and that is going to be 4 1-cost Diablos. Really the only thing that this deck is doing on turn 1 is trying to get out Diablo, so they're probably going to mulligan for it pretty aggressively, which they can take advantage of because they only have 10 uninkables in the deck, so mulliganing aggressively isn't too risky for them. You could also potentially go Hidden Cove on 1, but that seems a little greedy when your opponent could potentially just get out characters and banish it before you're able to get really get any value from it. But it is worth noting it is also a 1-drop. In the 2-drop slot, we do have 4 morphs. Morph is going to let you shift out some of those characters that may not have relevant shift targets or characters that you're not playing shift targets for in the deck. He is also another way to potentially take advantage of Diablo if you don't have that turn 1 Diablo, since any character with shift can shift onto a morph. Also, we are playing Ursula Deceiver, a 2-cost inkable, questing for 1/3 stat line, which is definitely decent. And when she comes into play, she's another way to look at your opponent's hand and really take stock of what they're potentially going to do, much like Diablo. But she's also going to let you go ahead and remove a song from it and send it to their discard pile if they have one. We have Anna, a very versatile card, a 3-cost uninkable character, questing for 2, which is great. You can pay 3 additional ink, so putting her down on turn 6 to take advantage of some not irrelevant abilities to deal with your opponent's board. Then we do also have that 3-cost uninkable Diablo, like I mentioned. And I said this deck was on 10 uninkables, it is on 14 uninkables, which is still going to allow you to mulligan pretty aggressively. Diablo is a 3-cost uninkable character, 2/2 stat line, so he does die to a lot of stuff, but he is evasive, so he is a little bit harder to banish there, and whenever he is exerted, you're going to draw a card every time your opponent draws a card. If you can go ahead and discard an action to take advantage of shifting him, especially if you can do that on turn 2, he's a great way to start getting some card draw right at the beginning of the game, while you're also using those cards to make your opponent opponent discard. Speaking of making your opponent discard, we have 3 uninkable Prince Johns, a 1/2 stat line questing for 2. Another reason I thought Grab Your Swords was pretty good in Steel Song, because he does have Ward, and they're generally not going to quest with him. He is just going to sit there, and every time you discard a card, Prince John is going to let them draw a card, which is nutty. If they get a couple Prince Johns out, it can be pretty terrible for you. Then we have Ursula, Deceiver of All, a 3-cost inkable character. I believe she's a 2/3 stat line, questing for 1, but questing is not what she is here for. Whenever she sings a song, you get to sing it twice. So you get to sing those Sudden Chills twice, make them discard 2 cards, Storm Rage on, deal 4 damage, draw 2 cards, Strength of a Raging Fire twice. It's absolutely crazy. Ursula has fallen out of favor in the meta because she does die to a lot of things, but if you can get her down at an appropriate time and take advantage of her, she is very good. Then we have Pete Games Referee, who we have talked about already time and time again. Shut off your opponent's actions, very good. 2 Muses, a 4-cost inkable character, also with Ward, questing for 1. Again, not necessarily a card you're going to be questing with. What she is going to be here for is going to be to bounce your opponent's characters back to their hand every time you play an action if they have less than 2 attack. Then we are on Beast, great to shift onto Morph on turn 3. He is a shift 3, even though he is a 5-cost. We run in 4 of these in the deck, and at the beginning of your turn, if he has no damage on him, he is going to let you draw an additional card, which is great. And if he does have damage on him, he is going to get +4 attack during your turn, attacking for 7 and dealing with locations quite well. Still fantastic card. Again, fallen out of favor in the meta a little bit recently, but obviously still a card that is very good in the right situation. In the 6-drop slot, we are on 2 Tinkerbell. She is shifting for 4, again potentially taking advantage of that Morph, dealing 1 damage to every opposing character, and when she banishes a character in a challenge, you can deal 2 damage to any character you would like. So it is a fantastic way to just control the board, prevent your opponent from questing, because they know you're going to be able to start banishing their unexerted characters by taking advantage of that Tinkerbell's 4 attack, which is quite good. 4 Sudden Chills to make your opponent discard, 4 Hypnotize to make your opponent discard and draw a card, 4 Storm Rage on to deal some damage, 4 Strength of a Raging Fire to deal some damage. We don't talk about Bruno in something we haven't talked about yet, no pun intended. A 5-cost inkable card will be singable with some of those cards like Beast and Tinkerbell potentially if it is relevant. I think more in general you're going to be hard casting this. It is going to be bouncing a character back to your opponent's hand, and then they'll be discarding a card at random. And then last but certainly not least, we are on 2 Hidden Cove, 1-cost inkable location, 1 to move in, 6 defense, and whenever a character is in there, they're going to get +1 attack and defense. Great way to keep those small characters out of the range of brawl, while also giving them stronger defense. So you get a Prince John in there, he is no longer going to die to Grab Your Sword. So Hidden Cove can be quite good to keep those characters from dying to things that would normally take them out. That is the breakdown on Emerald Steel discard. We'll go ahead and jump into our last off meta deck, which you may have seen my video from earlier in the week where I talked about this deck list. I've made a couple tweaks to it since then. I think the deck is really in a great position in the current meta. It is super good into steel, and that is Amber Sapphire Heroes, a aggro deck, a hyper aggro deck if you will. It's running 4 Daisy Duck, questing for 2, 1/4 character, letting your opponent draw a card when she quests. However, if it is a character they get to put in their hand, but if it's not a character like Be Prepared or something like that, it's going to go to the bottom of their deck. So you can actually get value out of Daisy Duck. She's not always letting your opponent draw. A lot of people are playing non-character cards. 4 Lilo, 1/1 for 1, questing for 2. She is what she is. We have 4 Queen as a shift line, a 1-cost inkable 2/2, questing for 1. She is mainly here as a shift line, like I mentioned. 4 Piglets, one of the best, most aggressive questers in the game, a 2-cost inkable character, 2/2 stat line, questing for 1. But if you have 3 or more characters in play, including him, he is going to get +2 lore, and that is going to pump him up to questing for 3 very early in the game. Then our other 2/2 drops, we have 2 Wendy Darling, a 1/3 stat line, great way to stay outside of steel, and she is questing for 2. If you want a more in-depth breakdown on this deck, like I mentioned, check out the video from earlier in the week. Anna, a 2-cost inkable 1/4 stat line, staying out of that steel damage. She is questing for 1, but if you have another hero in play, she is going to be questing for 2, which is entirely possible in this deck. Most of our cards are heroes. 4 Donald Ducks, a 2/3 for 3, questing for 1 with Bodyguard, so he's a great way to protect those Lilos and Piglets in the early game. And when he comes into play, you're going to be able to give another character +1 lore for the turn. As long as you have another character in play, you can get an extra lore as soon as he comes into play, much like something like Merlin Goat. Then we are on 3 Judy Hops, a 2/3 character, questing for 2, coming down for 3 inkable. She does banish an item when she comes into play and lets the player draw a card. So not always great to let them draw a card, but generally Ruby Sapphire and stuff, the decks you're going to be taking out an item from are drawing so many cards already, letting them draw one more typically isn't going to be the end of the world. And she is also a hero, so she is going to trigger your Ana. Then next up in the 3-drop slot, we do have Mickey Mouse Detective, a 3-cost uninkable character, 1/3 stat line, questing for 1. But when he comes into play, he's going to be able to net you an additional ink, and he's going to be able to trigger your Ana because he is a hero to be able to allow her to quest for 2. In the 4-drop slot, we are on 4 Rapunzel gifted with healing, not the fancy ones. You can play the regular ones. I don't know why Dreamborn.Inc. wants them all to be the fancy ones, but that's fine. A 4-cost inkable character, 1/5 stat line, so again, well outside of what steal damage is going to do. Same thing with Mickey. And when she comes into play, she's going to heal target character for up to 3 damage and net you potentially 3 cards or 1 card for each 1 damage healed. And we have our big Ana, one of the additions since the deck breakdown video, a 4-cost inkable character, 2/4 stat line, questing for 2, so you're not always going to be able to get value out of her because she does die to brawl. So in the Ruby matchup, she is potentially just going to be inking your inkwell. When she quests, she's going to give all your other heroes an opportunity to quest for 1 additional lore. It is worth noting in this instance that Lilo is a hero, so she is going to be affected by this ability, as is Piglet, and most of the other cards, the other 2 1-drops, are not. Another card that is not a hero is going to be the Queen, Commanding Presence, a 5-cost inkable character, 4/3 stat line, questing for 2, shifting for 2, which is nutty. And whenever she quests, she's going to give a target character +4 attack and a target opposing character -4 attack. So you're going to be able to give one of your opponent's characters -4, and then you could potentially give one of your opponent's characters +4 to take advantage of World's Greatest Criminal Mind, or give one of your own characters +4 to get a favorable attack when it's relevant. Our only 6-cost character, a 6-cost uninkable Perdita, Devoted Mother, a 3 of in the deck, 1/6 stat line, questing for 2, and whenever she comes into play and whenever she quests, she is going to be able to return one of those characters from your discard pile directly to play, which is nuts. So when you put her down, you can get your Anas back, you can get those Daisies back, Lilos, Piglets, whatever is going to be the most relevant for you. Another new addition to the deck that did replace Let It Go, as Let It Go did feel a little bit slow, and this card is hugely important for being able to rip Be Prepared's locations, items when it is relevant, is going to be the Bare Necessities, a 2-cost inkable song. Typically you're not going to be singing this, you are generally going to be hard casting it, especially because you'll probably have limited cards in your hand, but it's going to let you not only see your opponent's hand and know what you're going to be dealing with, it's going to let you straight up discard a non-character card. Then we are on 4 World's Greatest Criminal Mind, a 3-cost inkable song. Again, probably not going to be singing it, and it's going to allow you to banish any character with 5 attack or more. It is worth noting that the Queen is going to be able to boost up your opponent's characters even if they don't have 5 attack and give you the opportunity to banish them. It's also a great way to deal with Tamatoa and Big Cinderella. We are on 2 Pride Land, a 3-cost inkable, 2 to move in, 8 willpower, so great for keeping it alive. And when you get 3 characters in there, you can choose to banish it, return a character from your banish pile to play. If you can use it to get back something like Perdita, she is also going to trigger her ability and return an additional character to play, which is nuts. 3 Winter Camp, a 3-cost inkable location, 1 to move in, another 8 willpower location, which is great, particularly into that steel matchup. Whenever a character quests will heal, so they're able to take advantage of this ability while questing, they are going to go ahead and heal for 2, and if they're a hero character, they can heal for 4. And the final location in the deck, we are on 2 McDuck Manors, a 4-cost inkable location, 1 to move in, which you're generally not going to want to do because it nets you no value, and a 9 willpower. 9. So it stays out of range of pretty much everything, and it is going to net you 2 passive lore at the beginning of each turn. I think this deck is in a fantastic position into the current meta, unless you sit down and play against Ruby Amethyst all day, because that matchup is tough. I feel like it's going to go pretty well for you. If you're in a Ruby Amethyst heavy meta, which I think is going to be unlikely this set championship, maybe look at playing something else. But if you're in that steel heavy meta, which I think is what most people are going to be dealing with, this deck could really be a surprise to some people. Last but certainly not least, for our meta decks, we are going to be talking about friend of the channel, Jonathan Williams' top 8 Ruby Sapphire control that he played in DLC Vegas. He did end up in 6th, secured a golden Mickey with this list. I think this list is in a super good position into the current meta. Its matchup into Emerald Steel can definitely be pretty rough, so if you think a lot of people are going to be playing Emerald Steel specifically, maybe consider something else, but its matchup into everything else in the meta is pretty good with effective mulligans and effective drawing, effective playing. It is a little bit more of a difficult deck to pilot, but if you pilot it well, it's got a lot of control options. We are on 4 T-Bow to go ahead and ink ramp right away. As you can see, there's no 1-cost characters because our 1-costs are all in the items with Vitalosphere, Ice Block, and Popsicle coming in and doing their thing, drawing new cards, giving stuff minus attack, all that good stuff. Ice Block specifically is a good way to take advantage of that Sisu Daring Visitor, a 3 3-cost unequal character, 1/1 evasive. So if they don't have evasive or direct damage, she can potentially get some quests in for you in the early game, but she's here more for that ability that when you play this character, banish chosen opposing character with 1 or less attack. It is also potential that if they don't have that evasive character to attack into it or to remove it, and they're just letting you quest in for 1, she can remain on the board to be a shift target for the big Sisu. Jumping over the 4-cost slot, we are on 3 Grand Matala, a 3/3 inkable character questing for 1. When it comes into play, you're going to be able to look at your top 2 cards, put 1 in your hand, 1 on the bottom, so a great way to draw some cards, and she is also a great option to sing cards like How Far I'll Go, or even 1 jump ahead if it is relevant. Ideally on 4 though, you want to be able to jump into that Hiram with something like Popsicle on the board, a 1/6 character coming down for 4. He's inkable and questing for 1, but generally you aren't going to want to ink these unless you get a ton of them. Whenever he comes into play or quests, you may banish an item to go ahead and draw 2 cards. We're on 3 Mauis. This is probably the only deck I've ever seen run 3 Mauis. He's like a surefire 4 of in most Ruby decks in my opinion, but he ran 3 and it clearly worked out for him, probably to fit that Scar in there as the 4th, but he's going to be Reckless and Rush with a 6/5 stat line. We are on 3 of those Medusas, removing any character in front of us with 3 or less attack, which is always great. Good way to deal with those Robin Hoods in the steel matchup. We're on Scar, a 7-cost uninkable character, 6/5 stat line, same as Maui, questing for 2, but when he comes into play, he does have Rush like Maui as well, but when he banishes a character in a challenge, you may go ahead and ready him, so he can potentially wipe boards all on his own. We have 4 of the 8-cost Sisu, 5/4 stat line, questing for 3, great combination with Lucky Dime, and when she comes into play, she's going to banish all opposing characters with 2 or less attack. Again, great time to take advantage of that ice block. If they have something like Robin Hood out, you can ice block it down to that 2 and take advantage of Sisu's ability to remove big Robin Hoods as well. For Tamatoa, a 8-cost inkable character, 5/8 stat line, which is fantastic because it doesn't die to pretty much anything. Not a lot of people are attacking for 8 with 1 character. It can be removed with things like Let It Go and World's Greatest Criminal Mind. It is going to return an item from your banish pile to your hand, both when it enters play and when it attacks, potentially allowing you the opportunity to take advantage of those popsicles more than once, and it's going to net an additional lore for each item that you have in play. So if you're particularly item heavy on the board, Tamatoa could be in a position where he's questing for 3, 4, 5, and then you're lucky diming him as well and winning in 2 turns. Last up in the characters, we have 4 Maleficent Dragon, a 9-cost character, 7/5 stat line, questing for 2, and when she comes into play, you're just going to be able to straight up banish a character. So as long as it doesn't have ward, it dies to Maleficent Dragon. We're on 2 Hideaways, which I thought was really interesting in this list, a 2-cost action. It does let you put an opposing item or location into your opponent's inkwell. It's a great way to deal with the Lucky Dimes in the mirror, and great way to deal with locations, which was one of the biggest problems for this deck in the past. Locations would come down and just absolutely demolish Ruby Sapphire, but Hideaway has kind of put the kibosh on that. It has taken away from the potential to play more 1 jump ahead. Now we are only on 2 1 jump ahead in this deck. It is going to let you ramp an additional ink for 2 ink, and it is singable with something like that Sisu if you want to take advantage of that. We have moved away from Develop Our Brain in this deck, playing instead Visions of the Future, a 2-cost inkable song. Instead of letting you look at your top 2 cards like Develop Your Brain, it's going to let you look at your top 5 cards and choose one to put in your hand. 4 Brawls to deal with any character with 2 or less attack. 2 How Far I'll Go to go ahead and ramp you some ink and draw you a card for 4. Also, like I mentioned, singable with Tala and Hiram. 2 Be Prepared, still on Be Prepared, even though there's 4 Sisu, so a lot of board wipe potential for this deck. 2 Vitalispheres to go ahead and get Rush, or just to use as a banish option for Hiram or take advantage of with Tamatoa. 2 Ice Blocks to give your opponents minus attack to get more favorable attacks in, or to banish them with Sisu or the small Sisu or Brawl. Lots of things that can potentially take advantage of Ice Block in this deck. Popsicle for the card draw, sometimes for the healing when it's relevant, and because you can recur it with those Tamatoas. We've moved down to 3 Fishbone Quills, so as you can see, I feel like Ruby Sapphire is in a position where it's ink ramping a little bit less than it used to, but it's still trying to ink ramp, and this is going to let you ink an additional card from your hand every single turn just by exerting it, and that card doesn't even have to be inkable. Then we are on 2 Lucky Dime, a 7-cost uninkable item that you can pay 2 and exert it and gain lore equal to target character's lore. Like I mentioned, Tamatoa can get up 4, 5, 6. You can take advantage of this to just straight out win games, and then you do have stuff that like Sisu that quests for 3, Scar that quests for 2, Maleficent Dragon that quests for 2 that you could use as targets also. And even if you're targeting a character that quests for 1, it's free lore, and so you might as well take advantage of it if you have the 2 2 ink available. Like I mentioned, super interesting deck to pilot. I think it does have a fairly decent matchup into Ruby Amethyst if you can push them into the late game with that board control. The matchup into Steel Song I think is fairly favorable for Ruby Sapphire because of the board control and the ability to remove those characters. You can play kind of differently, try to force them to Whole New World hardcast. If Amber Steel ever hardcasts Whole New World, they're probably not going to win that game unless they get an absolutely gas hand and somehow take advantage of that. But this deck I think is really favored. The Emerald Steel matchup, like I mentioned, is difficult, so if you are playing into a widely Emerald Steel meta, maybe not the deck to play. But those are the top 7 decks I would say to play at set championships. 4 that are going to be meta decks, so maybe stick to the meta decks if that's what you're more comfortable with. But if you're looking for something off meta, we have those 3 off meta options. Feel free to make tweaks, share your deck list in the comments below. Are you playing something totally outside of these 7 options? Definitely let me know. I always love to hear it. If you are playing something that is more in line with these 7 options, or if you're trying a deck list that we first founded on the channel, I would always love to hear that as well. Thank you guys so much for your support, for the comments, for the likes. It all means a ton to me. It's been really cool growing this channel with you guys. I'm so thankful to have such an excellent community. And when you see those toys, video games, and 7 of the top deck lists off in the distance, remember, it is not a mirage. You guys have a great day.